The Africa Progress Panel recently launched an in-depth follow-up to the 2015 Africa Progress Report entitled Lights, Power, Action. The report highlights the enormity and urgency of finding ways to expand energy access across Africa by placing the spotlight on two promising options. That is the off-grid solar power and mini-grids. Joining us in the studio to unpack this is Managing Director for the Africa at Eaton, that is Seydou Kane. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Colin.
Well, let's start off first by explaining the off-grid solar panel and the mini-grids. What are they?
So basically, we understand by mini-grid basically installation that go from residential, so we're talking about very few kilowatts, to 10 megawatt, more or less. And off-grid, as the term explains it, are basically installations that are completely in island, so basically in isolation of the grid.
How do they differ from the normal generic power generation tools that are available?
Right. So in the vast majority of countries right now in Africa, you have basically a central power generation point. So, for example, ESCOM power station, and then transmission lines that will take the electricity to the different areas. When we're talking about off-grid and mini-grid, you're talking basically about smaller, much smaller installation that are very flexible and that can be in very isolated and remote areas.
Now at the moment, how did the report address this issue of energy supply? And this follow-up report, what does it really update?
Mm-hmm. The report basically acknowledges the fact that if we don't focus on those off-grid and mini-grid solution, we will have a very hard time addressing the 600 million Africans today that do not have access to energy. So it's basically a fast track and another option, if you want, in the energy mix to address the access to power.
Now, it seems like it's a viable option to have power grids that are mini, because if there's an inconvenience of a power cut at one household, it doesn't mean that the whole neighborhood will be out of power. Mm-hmm. Then when we're talking about the localized option, mm-hmm. how does it differ then when it gets well entrenched onto the African continent, mm-hmm. and it becomes cross-border power trade?
Right. So cross-border power trade has been in existence, and you do have, in my mind, I think 5 pools that exist today in Africa. However, they represent only 8% of the consumption of power throughout the continent. So what we're saying, and also with institutions like the NEPAD and the African Development Bank, is to push for further cross-border trade as well in the energy space.
But then it doesn't talk about finances. I would imagine for any poor rural household, mm-hmm. that doesn't have access to electricity, for you to erect such infrastructure, you would either need a government subsidized program, mm-hmm. or if it's the commercial sector which is, mm-hmm. privatized, then it will really come costly, mm-hmm. to poor households.
Mm-hmm. And you're touching a very important point there, Colin. Obviously, the subsidy model is one that is one of the concerns. But together with that, you have as well the regulatory framework. As a whole, what we're saying is that those technologies, as for instance Eaton advocates, are technology that can democratize somehow the access to energy. And what you observe as well is that the cost of those, for instance, solar PV and storage solutions is going down very rapidly. So there is really an opportunity in Africa to leapfrog and use those technologies to basically democratize the use of energy.
Now, does the report hone in on the independent power producers?
Not specifically, but when you look at mini-grids, you have different types of mini-grids, right? So you have utilities type mini-grid, you have private mini-grid, and you have also what we call the PPP, right? The private-public partnership. So depending on the needs, countries like Senegal, for instance, or Rwanda have very successful programs when it comes to PPP. So depending on the needs and depending on the application, you would basically select which one fits best for your use.
Now, talking about solar, and say, for example, wind turbines. Which are the viable options that are suggested? Because when you're talking about different landscapes and plateaus in Africa as a whole, I'll give you an example about South Africa. For example, inland, you talked about a province like the Northwest where there is excessive sunlight. Then obviously solar would then be a viable option. But when you drive to the Eastern Cape where it's very windy and mountainous, then the wind turbines would be an option. So it varies from country to country. Then how does the report address this issue invariably?
Good. I think, you know, the report doesn't suggest a drastic or radical change. You know, you have to go gradually. But also when you talk about mini-grid or off-grid, you can find hybrid solutions, right? So, for instance, you could have solar mix with diesel, for instance, in terms of power generation, and complement each other, right? So you do have as well, to your question around what other sources, you have geothermal, you have biomass, you have hydro. So you have a whole array of renewable sources that we can tap into.
All right. Thank you very much for making time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Colin.